Thank you so much, Lucia and Filipa, for this invitation, and thank you, the Serpentine, for organizing this incredible event. I'm especially grateful to the two of you for inviting me to talk about plant politics, because these are two dimensions of my research that are usually not very connected, political philosophy and the philosophy of plant life. So this gave me an opportunity to really bridge that divide specifically for this event. But this is something I started doing also about 7 years ago when in January 2012 I published my still raw and experimental reflections on the vegetal traits of our political realities. At that time, I made a contribution to the special issue of the Peace Studies Journal on the Occupy movement, and the essay was titled "Resist Like a Plant on the Vegetal Life of Political Movements." While Occupy was the immediate pretext for writing that essay, I think the hypotheses that I arrived at the time extended beyond the global protests that went under that name. And in particular, I tried to wrest the very concept of movement, whether political or not, whether political or physical, from the iron grip of its association with animal existence and with locomotion. So one of the insights that we should all take from this is that plants also move, even though they do not move in space, they do not move from place to place, they participate in other kinds of movements that political phenomena are also comprised of. And so the features of Occupy that I identified then can give us an idea as to the shape of vegetal politics and its other iterations as well. And so I'll start by enumerating 7 of those features. First, being sessile. So plants are sessile beings. They do not usually move from the place where they grow. By contrast to those political actions where the crowds, packs, bands, flocks, herds of people march in the streets, demonstrations tied to a place, as in the case of Occupy, tied to a place where they linger on, turn this place into a site of their growth or decay. Having a unique sense of space, they follow another rhythm and pace, a time of life more recognizably vegetal than animal. The second feature is exposure. Mere physical presence is politicized as a group plants itself in a certain highly symbolic locale. The exposure of its members testifies both to their vulnerability in the face of harsh environmental conditions. Tents, as we know, are meager buffers between the protesters and bad weather, and it also testifies to the expressiveness of existence in its embodied outward aspect. Exposure is both vulnerability and expression, right? Making oneself or being made available and coming into contact, like a leaf or a flower that opens up. The third feature is anarchic growth and decay. So an animal usually grows from an embryo in a very systematic way. The whole plan of an animal is given there in miniature from the very beginning, and that is not the case in plants. They really grow anarchically, but also decay in a very surprising manner as well. Vegetal protest movements do not have a single command and control center. Their parts can thrive in one place and rot elsewhere, including at a global level, which was the case with Occupy, which thrived in one part of the world and was already on the decline in another. The brute fact, the facticity of a protracted physical presence at a site is coupled in this case with virtual dissemination via the social media and other online means of communication. This combination fosters the anarchy of political growth and decay, but also regulates the speeds with which they proceed, the speeds that are uneven, surprising even. The fourth feature is modularity. Modular growth is the mechanism of anarchic growth. When it is activated, the growth in question is modular. It adds architectural complexity by reiterating the already existing so-called simple units grouped into modules elsewhere in the geopolitical space. So you can think about branching out or leafing, a reiteration of seemingly the same part, a branch or a leaf, elsewhere. So complexity is created through this apparent simplicity of modules being replayed over and over again. An open mode of organizing, it affords the greatest freedom of combinations within the seemingly narrow confines of modules. Fifth, non-oppositionality. Of course, you will say any protest movement is oppositional by definition. And yet, vegetal movements, by overcoming the basic opposition of an animal organism to its place, rise above that logic. And consequently, they rid themselves of some of the reactive luggage weighing down much political activism and inflicting passive citizen complaints about pervasive corruption, something that I want to talk to you as well later on today. The sixth feature is mutability. Vegetal politics is not the politics of abstract principles, but of an ongoing metamorphosis. Although occupying its original shape may have disappeared from our radars by now, it has spawned viable political candidates and developments in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, candidates and developments who or that would not have been possible without it. And finally, the final feature is hylomorphism, or literally mattered form. Just as there is no abstract principle in vegetal politics, so there is no formal program of development independent of actual growth, decay, and metamorphosis. This negation of vacuous forms, of form as an empty container to be filled with anything whatsoever, means two things: informality and deformalization. Political forms, in this vegetal kind of sense, are inseparable from the matters of politics, and they shift along with those matters. The context is what defines a vegetal political movement. Vegetal movements illustrate the political ramifications of this thesis. Now, but what I want to avoid doing is idealizing or romanticizing vegetal political movements by limiting them to the so-called progressive causes. For all the intellectual animosity widespread on the left to sovereignty and centralized authority, these, I claim, are not today's enemies. These are not our enemies. We conjure them up at best from the day before yesterday. Anarchic, plant-inspired resistance to the consolidated organization of an animal-like totality is now nothing but an illusion. Without knowing it, establishment politics too is vegetal, hylomorphic, mutable, not directly oppositional, modular, anarchically growing and decaying. The clash, if it is one, is taking place within the folds of vegetality. So vegetal politics now spans the oppositional divide and the so-called status quo, the establishment. This clash is happening within the folds of vegetality, which is, with the mediation of the image of a network or the web, imperceptibly defining our idea of being as such. So just as we think about ontology, the very meaning of being is a kind of network or a web, so being at all kinds of levels, including the political kind of being, is vegetal, regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of right or left. Let's take the worst of today's politics. Along with corruption, opportunism is one of the dirty names for political systems and their pernicious workings in every corner of the world. So much so that in the vernacular and in populist discourse, these two words, opportunism and corruption, become synonymous with politics. And we know this in all corners of Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Corruption and opportunism are the recurring complaints with what is wrong with politics today. What I propose is that the critiques of current political systems and processes point toward the underside of vegetal trajectories, of growth as opportunism, of decay in the case of corruption, and metamorphosis, or what I call non-identity politics, understood as the perversions of and deviations from the ideal of good politics. I want to give these deviations a positive twist in order to get out of the quagmire of pure negativity, cynicism, resignation, and ultimately paralysis that accompany the widespread and ceaseless criticisms of the status quo. So I want to think about the worst of what's happening with politics today, including especially opportunism and corruption in vegetal terms. Let's then start with opportunism. Opportunism has long been a derogatory term for the absence of core principles behind personal or political conduct. Concretely, it may entail forging tactical strategic alliances with those previously deemed the enemies, breaking past promises, and acting according to the changing circumstances. Vladimir Lenin famously railed against the opportunism of social democrats, chief among them Karl Kautsky, who according to him betrayed Marxism. Short of defining opportunism, Lenin notes that it was, and in his words, first a mood, then a trend, until it finally formed a group or a stratum of political agents who pay lip service to their cause, the revolution. As a mood, opportunism is ubiquitous. It saturates the political atmosphere. As a trend, it turns into a principle of no principles behind much of political talk and action. As a stratum, it condenses into a political subject attuned more to the prevailing moods and trends than to a clear program or ideas. But could we not say that plant growth is opportunistic, and it's a term used by plant scientists very seriously? Without a fixed architectural blueprint for a mature tree, a sapling will develop there where conditions are more favorable. It will grow more and longer branches on the sunny side, send its roots to the most resource-rich patches of soil, and create alliances with insects, fungi, birds, etc., depending on the shifting circumstances. Modular development or modular growth is triggered at those meristems, those embryonic parts of branches or leaves, at which the environmental conditions are propitious for further growth. Highly attuned to fluctuations in its developmental context, a growing plant is of a piece with the dynamics of its place. To qualify vegetal growth as opportunistic, therefore, is to affirm its non-oppositionality, plasticity, mutability, and hylomorphism. Whereas a principled stance makes an appeal to the unchangeable core, a deep layer of tenets and convictions that cannot be violated without interfering with the identity of the one ready to swear by them, opportunism moves on the surface, or better, at the interface of the opportunist and the political milieu, as it monitors and responds to the morphing edges of things. That is why Lenin links opportunism in the first instance to a mood, a fleeting state of mind that does not constitute the identity of the one who is in it. Instead of the principle of solidarity, strictly divided across class or other lines, opportunists receive their cues from the political conjuncture, from the circumstances that present the ever-fresh collaborative possibilities. Arguably, Lenin himself did so when he recruited the masses of Russian landless peasants for the cause of a proletarian revolution. His own approach to opportunism was not principled, but precisely opportunistic. In short, a politics of transcendental principles and truths is blind to the historical context of concerted action, which is equivalent to the place and time of plant growth. But opportunism is utterly immersed, on the other hand, in and driven by this context, which makes it existentially vibrant. Plants are the beings of their context, of their milieu, which is the case with what we call opportunism. Now, Lenin does not hesitate to resort to the language of botany in describing opportunism. It is, he writes, overripe. This is his word, переспел, overripe. Opportunist political activism is a sign of decay, of having crossed over to the bourgeois camp, in Lenin's words, seeing that the bourgeois regime is in a state of decomposition, rotting into the ground in which a socialist and later a communist order would germinate. And this leads us, in turn, to the issues of political corruption that are on people's minds and, if nominally, on the populist agenda, irrespective of the national belonging of those concerned with corruption. When the undoubtedly justifiable complaints about corruption switch into an active gear, they routinely prompt calls for widespread purges in the echelons of power. So that is why in electoral systems we have the election of those who are presumably inexperienced, who are outside the political sphere. There needs to be a purge of the entire political class, as it were, right, to deal with corruption. Before contemplating possible solutions, however, it would be prudent to think through the meaning of corruption, keeping at bay the repulsion it involuntarily induces in us. The moment we do so, we realize that the nightmare of the always worsening political corruption is a shadow cast by the neoliberal dream of infinite economic growth. Both fantasies are untenable, and so I'm arguing that these persistent complaints about political corruption, justified as they are the underside of the neoliberal fantasy of a consistent, infinite economic growth. Both fantasies are untenable. Just as nothing can grow infinitely, so it is impossible for something, say politics, to rot without end. What we have before us are two movements of vegetality, growth and decay, isolated from one another, ideologically driven apart and allocated to different domains of human activity, economics on the one hand, politics on the other. And they become monstrous, immeasurable, incommensurable due to their uncoupling, which is in any event never complete. For plants to grow, there has to be decay going on down in the earth, so there has to be a linkage necessarily. This severance of one movement from the other can never be complete. Non-oppositionality applies to the vegetal movements of growth and decay in economics and politics. The corruption and decay of the public sphere feeds neoliberal growth, which causes a further deterioration in the not yet privatized and in the non-privatizable. Rather than cleanse body politic of the signs of rotting it exhibits, we must ground the growing and the decaying otherwise, as Marx and Lenin did when they inadvertently vegetalized modes of production and showed how a new world is born from the putrefying remains of the old. They didn't say, let's do away completely with capitalism and build something completely different in thin air. It's as if socialism and communism germinate in the rotting soil of capitalism. They vegetalized modes of production in that sense. For whatever rots is conducive to the future of life, to the future of life itself. The temptation to purge corruption is nonetheless exceptionally strong, notably in post-revolutionary periods, as in Robespierre's France or in Stalin's Soviet Union. And it is an idealist and an anti-vegetal tendency to enact these purges, I would claim. The deadly idealism of these regimes has for its enemy the materiality of existence, inevitably viewed as imperfect under the magnifying glass of an ideal. Robespierre construes the French Revolution in messianic terms as a chance to excoriate, in his words, the last excesses of human corruption, for which there is no cure but the guillotine. Hegel interprets the ensuing reign of terror as the triumph of sheer negativity, announcing absolute freedom, the freedom of spirit from matter, hence spirit's voiding, its transformation into a void, an abyss. It is the logical culmination of the Enlightenment, craving for total transparency, a government by and of pure reason. The project turns out to be deadly because it embraces exposure and strives to eliminate obscurity, cutting existence figured in a vegetal manner from its roots. And this is the problem with the Enlightenment. It dreams of feeding on the light of reason alone in a sort of sublimated, deranged photosynthesis, while rejecting the nourishment decay provides in the dense darkness of the earth. Right? It dreams of a break with what is opaque, impenetrable, and so on. Right? The very stuff of the soil in which our roots are, our unconscious roots are. In so doing, it undercuts the double character of human existence distributed along the conscious-unconscious axis, reflecting the life of plants above and below ground and the disparate modes of energy production corresponding to these regions. So yes, we do feed on light. We also photosynthesize in our conscious, as it were, existence, but the unconscious is mired in this obscurity of the soil, of the personal and cultural soil that we live in. Enough deconstructive criticism has been leveled at the transparency of meanings, intentions, and even desires. At the same time, the transparency of the public sphere has remained the yardstick of a laudable politics. Such cherry picking is internally inconsistent. Psychic life cannot be subject to a different set of rules, to rules that are poles apart from those regulating political existence. Transparency is crystalline, mineral, not yet or already not alive, not yet or already not vegetal. Something is inevitably rotten in the state of Denmark. I'm citing, of course, a famous line from Hamlet. In the state of Denmark, standing for any state or political institution that in the course of its history distorts its founding intent, itself incipiently distorted inasmuch as it shelters an impulse and its exact opposite. Instead of the usual insistence on the transparency of the public sphere, we should try to reconnect its conscious manifestations to their unconscious roots, without the hope of fully exposing either these roots or the ground they are buried in. In other words, what we need to do is to carry out a vegetally inflected psychoanalysis of corruption. The work of a phytopolitical psychoanalysis is as indispensable as it is daunting in its immensity. Still, before it may begin, we must ask, what exactly is corrupted in today's corruption allegations and scandals? Is it the reputation, personality, or conscience of public officials, political institutions and processes, or both? On the psychological side of things, the popular culprit is greed, a limitless desire for personal enrichment at the expense of state funds. On the political side, usually we hold at fault the inefficient mechanisms of control, lacking the checks and balances and independent accountability procedures. Corruption slips private in place of public interests. Explanations abound, but in the midst of them all, the main problem tends to be overlooked, notably that there is no common good in late capitalism. It has been ideologically eliminated from people's minds and from political programs alike. What is the sense of being honest or corrupt on the playing field of a corrupt, hopelessly rigged politico-economic game? Whenever it makes a rare comeback, the common good only briefly flashes before our eyes with regard to the fragile and shared conditions of possibility for life that we're on the verge of losing, like having breathable air that is not dangerously polluted. So the common good that remains is ecological in that sense. We could maybe think about elemental communism as the last hope we have here. Other than that, the secret of contemporary corruption is that there is nothing corruptible, nothing primed for rotting, and so no soil for the political plants that we are to grow in. And the third and final movement that I want to borrow from Aristotle, and here I'm following his fourfold categorization of movements into locomotion, growth, decay, and metamorphosis, is precisely change of state or metamorphosis. Mutability is not just one of the qualities of plants and of the politics they inspire. It is above all what plants are, perpetual metamorphosis. And this was the view held by someone like Goethe, for instance, as well. Plants do not just metamorphose, they are metamorphosis. According to plant scientists, changes of state is how plants behave, initiating chains of morphological or physiological alterations in response to events in their milieu. What an animal accomplishes by moving its limbs that allow it, for instance, to flee from danger, a plant does by changing its growth patterns and directions at root and shoot meristems, shedding the existing or growing new tissues, or initiating nearly instantaneous changes in their chloroplasts in order to avoid photoinhibition. The behavior of political institutions is more akin to that of plants than of animals. After all, the polis, the state, the empire, and are territorial entities that, despite differences between the geopolitical, geographical, geophysical, and existential kinds of spatiality, span a constellation of places. And aren't the forms of political community I've listed, the polis, the state, the empire, themselves proofs of a vegetal political metamorphosis, of behavior via changes of state, from which even the political state is not immune? To the question regarding the trigger events for this shape-shifting behavior, a typical Marxist response is the unstable conditions for the appropriation or expropriation of wealth. Just as both plants and animals act to nourish themselves, to develop defenses from threatening stimuli, and to reproduce, so do political institutions. In a situation of war, which could not, it seems, be more animalistic, the troops themselves advance and retreat, but the polity they defend or attack does not go anywhere. It either grows or contracts. The empire is the quantitative growth of a state that, at a certain tipping point, becomes qualitatively different, no longer a state, but precisely an empire. The rule of transnational capital does more than that. It undermines state sovereignty and, up to a point, uproots the political communities it feeds on, heralding their final metamorphosis into something non-vegetal. Now, identity politics is a case in point of betraying and actually freezing vegetal political movements. Whether it affects animals, plants, or humans, an identity stiffens behavior into a mask. It refers to what, not to how, something or someone is. This is what identity does. It stiffens mutable things into a hard mask. The divisiveness of identity politics has to do with its exclusivity, a shrinking of its categorical boundaries until at its most determinate, it admits only the population of one. The mask fits only one. Identity precludes growth and decay. Like transparency, it is closer to the world of minerals than that of plants, which is why also it is so brittle despite its stiffness and shatters easily into tiny bits. And, like abstract principles, it pre-exists its contents. Richly differentiated as it may seem, especially in comparison with the simple, infinitely iterable modules of vegetal growth, identity is formally poor. It isolates, posing barriers to solidarity. Plant politics, on the other hand, is a politics of non-identity, thanks to the mutability and hylomorphism ingrained in vegetal ontology. A non-identity politics drastically reorients our perspectives on community, solidarity, coalition, and alliance building to the extent that it starts from the middle, from the spaces that are neither this nor that, and that are both this and that. In the case of plants, the meristems, transition zones around the roots, feedback loops with environmental conditions. This kind of politics and this kind of existence does not start from a self-contained unit or a series of self-contained units that need to be somehow articulated with one another a posteriori. Stretching toward the things it binds from the middle, non-identity politics is relational, provided that by relation we mean both the common and that which is no one's, what belongs to two or more elements and the no man's, no woman's, no plant's land in between. The stretch, the span of non-identity, is the space and time of plants, the space and time that are also ours, if and when we refrain from chopping ourselves and the world up into fully independent, discrete entities, and instead embrace constant metamorphosis of ourselves and the world, of ourselves into the world, and the world into ourselves. Vegetal movements and politics have this deformalizing effect, and they're also rooted, as though it were their cause, in the weakness of the human levees trying in vain to contain the torrents of life. Thank you for your attention.